All we're hearing is one side in the popular media. So that's why I say it's 90% hype and 10% reality. So that's my take on global warming. And Ed.
In the last month, Science News has had a brief little thing saying that on Mars, the southern ice cap is shrinking measurably over the last century, which means that's warming up there also. And there's no human pollution.
I think I read that too. Therefore, the upshot of that would be there's a little more solar radiation, wouldn't you say? Like some evolutionary scientists actually believe. I've pulled it out of the literature. Feel that we think there's a little more energy from the sun that's part of the global warming. So it's a controversial issue that's we're only getting one side. Yes?
I would like to add one more thing for Mike. Some years ago I did some calculations on the mechanism for getting chlorofluorocarbons.
Mm-hmm.
Ozone layer.
Doesn't work.
Not efficient. You can get more nitrogen into the ozone layer than you can get those things, much more nitrogen.
Okay. So maybe we're just looking at natural fluctuations?
I think so.
See, we don't really have a long enough a record to know what's going on, whether it goes like this or it's always been there. So, thanks. Yes?
What's the latest on the canopy?
Oh, the vapor canopy? Okay. It's like a lot of things that are controversial. I like to use meteorological jargon to say how I stand at this moment. So I believe in the vapor canopy 30%. Give it a 30% probability of being correct.
It's like a forecast, huh?
Yeah. But, you know, and it might change with time with more data. The reason I used to go along with the 80% because it made so much sense. And by the way, it's not an absolute from the Bible. It's not absolutely there. It's a interpretation, a reasonable one. And I think those verses are reasonable. And it's also reasonable to do research on it. But because of Larry Vardaman's research, it has a heat problem. Because it's going to absorb too much solar and infrared radiation, and the surface is going to be too hot, number one, if you have too much water vapor in that vapor canopy. Number two, as it condenses out during the flood, it adds so much latent heat that it's going to heat the atmosphere too much. So those are some of the problems. It's possible to have maybe a vapor canopy with not so much water in it, and it still have an effect of a fairly uniform climate on the Earth, and maybe not have any rain at all. I mean, it's possible. But it needs to be worked on. And Larry's model is rather a simple one-dimensional radiation model. What we need is a three-dimensional general circulation model for it and see what happens. And therefore, I go along with it still 30% instead of 0. See, it's like that with a lot of other things, like catastrophic plate tectonics. I accept that 20%. And I might change my mind, yes, with time.
If the vapor canopy was high enough, it would be ice. It would be a clear layer of ice around the Earth.
Except it absorbs so much solar and infrared radiation, it'd be a vapor. I'd say that's probably, Larry Vardaman's modeled it, and if you have, you know, say 40 feet of precipitable water up there, it's going to be hot. It's going to be a vapor. But if it could be an ice if you only have, say, 3 feet. But even that, I think he's modeled to be pretty warm. So some people have thought of an ice shell. But the problem with an ice shell, if it's too thick, you might not see the stars to it, like it says in Genesis, before the flood you saw the stars. But also it'd be mechanically unstable with an ice shell, unless God had a miracle to keep it up there. I guess that's possible, but I would go along that it was either a thin vapor canopy or there wasn't any. There's other explanations for the warm climate vegetation we find up in the high latitudes, which I've investigated. There's lots of high latitude warm climate vegetation and organisms like crocodiles, which can't handle very cold winters up there at 80 degrees north in Axel Heiberg Island. And I think that a lot of that stuff could be taken up during the flood, and still be in a high state of preservation, especially if it gets caught in a current going 100 miles an hour that's going north. It'll be up there very, very quickly. So I think there's other explanations, and there's also the idea of there's other ideas out there. So, but to try to explain the pre-flood Earth, the pre-flood Earth explaining that, it gets into a huge amount of speculation. I think it's hard enough just to explain some of the stuff of the flood from the rocks and fossils we see, but the pre-flood Earth, we got a mile deep of sediments on the continents, and we've had all kinds of tectonics, land going up, land going down. So we haven't got an idea what the geography was like because we've covered it with a mile deep of sediments and we moved it up and down. So we don't know the geography or the topography. We don't know where the oceans were. There's a lot we don't know about the pre-flood Earth, except I would say the one thing we do know is the water was probably less salty because during the flood you'd have so much salts eroded from the erosion that they'd end up in the ocean after the flood. So the water was probably close to fresh before the flood. I think we can deduce that fairly well. But other things is just a guesstimate again. So, good questions. Okay, way back in the back row. Yes, you.
Why did some of the creatures that were in the Ice Age didn't die out in extinction?
Why didn't the creatures in the Ice Age, the ones that did survive, why they didn't die out?
Yeah.
Like elk, deer, the bison?
Uh-huh.
I'll tell you the short answer. I don't know. Could it be that these animals were in the mountains more, which had a little more precipitation and weren't so dry? Is that possible? While the horses and the camels and the woolly mammoths, that they lived on the plains and that's where they had the dust storms. I mean, that's a possibility, but that's speculation. Otherwise, I really don't know. So, good question. I wish I knew. Yes?
Did the Lost Squadron affect assumptions of age?
A little bit. The Lost Squadron, the question is the Lost Squadron that is in the southeast Greenland ice sheet, what does that mean? Well, it's interesting. I talked to the person back in Middleborough, Kentucky, where they were putting it together. I went and took a look at it, and I asked him, well, before you went to look for these planes that ditched there on the Greenland ice sheet in World War II, landed on the southeast Greenland ice sheet, how deep did you think the snow and ice was going to be above them that piled up after World War II? And he said 30 feet. Guess what? They were 265 feet down and about 2 miles down from where they landed. In other words, the glacier moved, and also it piled up a huge amount of precip since then. Well, the southeast part of the Greenland ice sheet is close to the water. It's low altitude, so they have a bullseye of high precip right there, and there only. They've had a lot of measurements on the Greenland ice sheet, and